Well, scientists do that all the time. They go for, you know, they know that there's a discovery that needs to be made, and you'll see 99% of the field working on, you know, that area. And one of the things I feel the same way, not just about writing, but about science, that I have certain personality traits.
Right.
And, you know, my whole career, people saying, you shouldn't be working on that, you should really be doing this. This is what's mainstream.
Right.
This is what's going to get you a job. And I couldn't, even if I wanted to. You know, there were moments where I even wanted to. I wanted a job. And so I would have joined the bandwagon. But it was there was such internal resistance. I was actually incapable of doing good physics. In that way. I really couldn't. I knew, you know, and then there came a time where I said, look, this is what I'm good at. I know what I'm good at. Weird ideas sometimes pan out, you know, and if I stay this sort of path, maybe I'll be lucky enough to be able to continue for decades, and maybe I won't, but, you know, I can't do the other.
That's marvelous.
And it's also funny when people bring up the gender issue a lot, which I won't talk about. I just wrote a piece about how I don't want to talk about it. But what's interesting is one of the things that it benefited me, because one of the ways in which it benefited me was that I couldn't fit in. And it was such a relief, because I couldn't fit in anyway, but I might have tried.
It gave you an excuse for the eccentricity that you were willed to do in the first place.
And
that's marvelous.
I would have really suffered by trying to walk the walk and be one of the guys, and, you know, there is that sort of phenomenon where there's a lot of admiration for the generation before, and people try to mimic it. And it was when I realized that I had been cut free from that, I decided to, like, embrace it, you know. It was totally liberating, and I think I did better physics. I'm totally hung up on this phrase now that you brought it up. I'm going to keep saying it.
This is such a wonderful description that you've just offered, because it leads me back to a better answer, in a funny way, to your very initial question. And that is that, in a sense, it was a self-identification as a certain kind of eccentric with certain interests and therefore certain potential offerings that led me to do exactly the work I do. That, in a sense, I looked, as the philosopher or the scientist looks at space and the massive experiments that have already been conducted to enormous satisfaction and are very compelling to me, and I saw a space in between. I said, you know, as much as there are people who, let's say, write like Borges and Calvino and, you know, Kobo Abe, and there are other people who write like Raymond Chandler and Richard Yates and, you know, Iris Murdoch, I don't think anyone's been quite as interested in both as I am. And if I let myself combine those two things and maybe try to fill in the space between them a little bit, I will be doing something that takes enormous sustenance from the existing field, but will seem to me and to others as radically new. Of course, not because it's without precedent, but precisely because it takes precedent in a slightly different way. It combines two things or fills in the space between two things in a way that might not quite have been.
It was well framed enough that people's attention could be focused and recognize it when they saw it.
Absolutely.
I mean, so when you think about the next thing that you're doing, is it just, I mean, how long are you noodling around before it strikes you, it hits you? Is it always like in the background? Because I find sometimes when I'm writing one thing, I'm thinking about, because I can't wait to get to the next thing. I'm almost just finishing so I can move on to the next.
The motivation to keep writing has almost always to do with the next project. And there are projects that are gestating for years in the background while I let myself execute smaller, you know, more easily boundaried projects. I mean, the novel I'm trying to begin this winter is going to take, it's another Fortress of Solitude, not in the sense that it's about Brooklyn or that it's about childhood, but in the sense that it's impossible for me to think about in any encompassing way. The number of different things I want to do, the only precedent in my experience was Fortress of Solitude. And I know that the only solution to that is to make a long, humble exploration of these elements and figure out what their deep relationship in my psyche has to do with, because they might seem if I describe them as they presently exist in my anticipations or visualizations, someone might say, well, that's 4 different books.
Right.
But I know that for some reason they're compellingly occupying the same room in my head, and I'm going to have to write the book to discover
I'm
what
so
that
glad
is.
you used that word, discover, because that's exactly an experience that I've been having. And so I start out thinking I'm going to try one thing, and I slowly discover the book that was lying there, you know, that corny, was it Michelangelo statement, every hunk of marble you'd have to discover the sculpture underneath.
Yeah.
And I do have this certain belief about that with books. I mean, I find that when you talk about the great masters, to me it's impossible that the books could be changed, even if they're flawed, deeply flawed books. It's impossible for me to imagine the books are anything other than the way that they are, almost as though they were discovered.
Right.
And that is the book. When people start criticize, when I read book reviews, which drive me insane.
Yeah.
Book review is a whole other story. It drives me insane reading the New York Times book review. I can't help but read it compulsively. But it's like looking at a car crash. You know, it's like gawking. But I hear reviewers say things like, well, there could have been less of this about the town. And I think, well, but that is the book. That's like saying your child could have been an inch shorter. I mean, it's an absurd statement to me.
Well, you've taken the words out of my mouth again. I mean, I've actually come to see that in some way I prefer flawed novels to quote-unquote perfect novels, because they seem to me almost always to have done something that's actually more complete. And by encompassing a flaw or an impossibility, some kind of rupture or some sort of distressing choice, by challenging the reader to accept some, say, switch of emphasis that's disruptive, they're more like experience. And the great thing about the novel as a form is that it has this potential to be various and encompassing. If you really want artistic purity of form, if you want that sense of the exclusion of everything unnecessary, you shouldn't really be chasing that as a reader of novels anyway. You should be listening to Bach fugues or perhaps...
Which have a certain mathematical structure.
Right. Or you know, there may be some poems that will satisfy you. But the novel is, in a way, another embracingly impure structure, like the kind of inquiry that you and I both engage in. It straddles paradoxes and impurities, and so if it encompasses flaws, those are often, for me, some of the most charged or important parts of the books I love. The unnecessary passages, the things that the reviewer might say, couldn't we have done without this? Well, the answer is probably a desperate no.
Mm-hmm. Which it's really interesting, which is why my relationship to reviews of my own books is strange, because even if I get good reviews, even though I get hugely great reviews, it doesn't satisfy me in any way. You know, I used to dream in a childish way, if I get that great review, I'm going to be on top of the moon. But actually, you can get all the great reviews in the world, you can line them up in your, press kit, and I still feel like unsatisfied in terms of what I'm getting back for what I put out.
You want to be engaged with in a way that a reviewer, almost by definition, isn't doing, because the review's not for you, it's for a possible consumer.
Right.
And so the engagement will come somewhere else, on a book tour, in a conversation with someone who read the book.
I was just going to say, that has been, even though I dread the book tours, and there are times where you're out there and you're thinking, what am I doing here, but then one person will just say that right thing, just that right thing. That was the word you were waiting to hear. That was the reaction you were waiting to hear for ages, and I wish I could package what this one guy said to me. This one guy in Chicago, said the perfect thing. I wish I could take that home and then just replay it when I need to, feel that relationship. And I think books are strange that way too, because you write in isolation, you talk about the solitary experience, and then you cast it out there and people read in isolation. And the only, reviews are this filter between you. And then, you have maybe a couple of weeks on the road where you meet a handful of people, maybe you get some emails. But otherwise it's a strange experience. You don't know where most of your books have landed or how they've been received or what they meant to people. And I find that strange. It's very different than being a live musician. I suppose artists could say they feel something similar.
Yeah. What about producing scientific results, and what's the context, the arena, and how does it feel to what kind of sounding do you get?
Yeah, it can be so complicated. So if you're having the same kind of experience or the same, the idea that you throw something out there, scientific work is often very solitary. I mean, I guess people do collaborate in big groups, but theorists tend to work alone, and even in collaboration, there's a lot of time where you spend alone calculating and working it out. It can be very gratifying to have an answer, and again, since it's objective, barring any actual errors in your calculation, you might be very excited about a result from the start. But yeah, it can be a very strange experience throwing that out there too. You meet with incredible resistance. It doesn't match with somebody else's idea. Someone's going to insist they thought of it first. And then you're getting also into this whole realm of where does my ego fit into this? How important is my ego in this experience? Do I really need credit or acclaim? Is that really what I'm doing here? I mean, you have to kind of temper that urge.